Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guests are Joshua Robinson and Jonathan Clegg, authors of the book, The Formula: How Rogues, Geniuses, and Speed Freaks Reengineered F1 into the world's fastest growing sport. Guys, welcome.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
So let's start off with you each giving a little bit about your background, about how you ended up being sports writers and what you're covering now. And then we'll talk about the book.
So
Great.
I'm Josh. I've been a sports writer for going on 20 years. I've been at the Journal since 2010, and I mostly cover European sports and things like, Formula One, but soccer, tennis, the Olympics. And for the past 12 years, I've lived in Europe, in London and Paris, and recently moved back to New York.
That's not such a bad job when you can live in those places for sure. So
And
why don't you also, Jonathan, tell us about yourself?
yeah, that's right. I'm John Clegg. I am the sports editor at the Wall Street Journal. Um, like Josh, I have also worked in sports journalism basically my entire professional life, 20 years or so now, and joined the Journal in 2009. I was the Journal's first Europe-based sports reporter, based out of London. And then I moved to New York to join the sports desk here in 2012, right after the London Olympics. And I've covered pretty much all major sports for the Journal in that time. Um, and yeah, wanted to be a sports writer basically as long as I can remember.
For the audience doesn't know, I started my life as a sports writer, writing for 5 years, and decided that long term, that wasn't going to make the most sense for me. But I still have such admiration and envy for you guys getting to go in the locker room and interview the most famous sports stars. And I love the Wall Street Journal's coverage of sports and the features that you guys produce. It's so well done. So let's talk about, why did you guys write the book? And Joshua, maybe you want to start off with that.
Sure. So both of us, John and I, grew up in Europe and had always, followed F1 growing up, and we sort of went through the same journey with it. We were super into it as kids, eventually kind of fell away from it as the sport itself, committed the cardinal sin of becoming boring, and kind of repetitive in the late 2000s and 2010s. So we both we're not as engaged with it as we'd always been. But in about 2000, I guess it was 21, no, 2022, I went to the first Miami Grand Prix, and I was covering it for the Journal and came away from it. And I remember speaking to John from the airport in Miami, and we had a conversation and thought, there's something happening here. Drive to Survive had come out during the pandemic. That's the hit Netflix show that did crazy numbers and sort of brought in a whole new kind of fan to the sport. And we saw the spectacle in Miami. We saw that America was suddenly getting into this distinctly European thing. And we thought, okay, there's something happening, and this is exactly what we want to write about for the next book.
And John, tell me what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, that's right. I think, this was a sort of subject matter that fell like squarely in our wheelhouse. We have written, this was our third book. Our first one was about the rise of the English Premier League, which also, sort of went from sort of distinctly, European, quite parochial sports league at the beginning of the 1990s and transformed into this sort of global behemoth that's watched in I think 197 countries in the world. More countries than are members of the United Nations get to watch the English Premier League every weekend. And having sort of unpacked that story and the rise of the Premier League, we sort of felt uniquely qualified to chronicle, the similar rise that had taken place in F1.
Hey, guys, I don't know anything about cars. I barely can push the button to start the electric car. But what's really the difference between and I've seen Formula One on TV. And what's super popular in the South in the United States, the different types of car racing that's there. What's the difference between these kinds of races and what's the skill set that's different?
I think both of these sports, F1 and NASCAR, which you're referring to, um, evolved on parallel tracks. NASCAR came out of a very American car culture. The idea was, hey, these are versions of cars that you can go out and buy, um, and that are souped up to be highly perform and go around in circles effectively, or ovals. F1 is not that at all. F1 treated itself as the research and development department for all of these iconic European brands. And they race on circuits that, have anywhere between 16 and 25 corners every lap. Each one is different. Each one comes with its own characteristics. And the idea is to see just how far you can push performance when within this set of rules that Formula One designs and mixes up every few years.
John, given the significant investment and radical design approach of the Mercedes W13, what specific internal debates or conflicting perspectives arose when the Mercedes team regarding the decision to proceed with the zero pod design? You have to even explain what that is
Yeah.
to the audience, especially considering the potential risk involved.
So I think this is, it might just sort of help to explain a little bit about sort of car development in F1. Because the whole sort of saga of the Mercedes W13, which is what opens the book, is really a tale that is sort of emblematic of the challenges of competing in F1. As Josh said, the first thing to know about Formula One is that like formula, the word formula in the title refers to the rules. That is the like sort of technical specifications that the teams have to adhere to when they produce their cars. And as Josh said, these are nothing like the NASCAR, vehicles that you see go round and round, round and round the oval. Formula One cars are sort of closer to sort of like NASA produced, highly engineered. Hundreds of millions of dollars is spent on engineering these cars that are the fastest in the world at going around the sort of tracks that F1 navigates. I think Indy cars are actually faster in a straight line, but these are cars that go upwards of 200 miles per hour. And the entire sport is really about aerodynamics because there are, so many corners in an F1 circuit. The sport is really about sort of trying to, make the most aerodynamically successful car possible to mitigate against wind resistance and all those sorts of things. So every year, F1 tweaks its guidelines and specifications, and the teams proceed to try and produce the car that can go fastest under those rules. And in the case of the Mercedes W13, Mercedes spent the entire off season sort of modeling out a design for the car that they thought would leave them at the front of the pack. Mercedes was this sort of dominant team of the late 2010s, and had won I think 7 titles during that time. And so they spent the off season, working in the wind tunnel on simulations, designing what they thought was the perfect car, and came up with this radical sort of new look for an F1 car. F1 cars look from the top down, look a bit like a sort of classic glass Coca-Cola bottle. They're sort of very narrow at the front, and then they spread out, and then at the back they usually have that sort of spoiler or wing, which gives F1 cars their classic look. Mercedes decided they'd do away with the bit that bumps out at the top of the Coca-Cola bottle. They would narrow that and produce a car with no side pods. And in all their simulations, this looked like it was going to be a unbeatable design. They were convinced that their car was going to leave everyone else in the dust. So much so that they kept it completely under wraps from everyone else. They didn't want anyone stealing their design, because as much as F1 is about designing the fastest car, if you can't do that, it's about stealing someone else's design, copying it, and seeing if you can beat them that way. Mercedes kept their car under wraps until the very first testing session of the season, which happens in Bahrain. F1 is a sport that circles the globe. They race in places from Singapore to Sao Paulo, major, on every single continent, bar Antarctica. And they kept this thing under wraps. They wheeled it out in Bahrain. They sat back and prepared to watch their creation leave the opposition, crush the opposition, and were mortified to find that they had actually built a complete clunker. The Mercedes W13 was generously described by Toto Wolff, the head of the Mercedes team, as a complete shitbox, and that was an apt description. The Mercedes dynasty, which had ruled over F1 for the best part of a decade, ended with the W13. They have not won a championship since, and it was a classic, F1 case of their design, that the model that they built, the simulations they ran, missed one tiny aspect, and that one tiny aspect, that one tiny flaw in their algorithms and their simulations turned to be a huge problem when a driver actually got into the car. And that is sort of, as I say, emblematic of the challenge of competing in F1. It is as much an engineering problem to be solved as it is a race to go and win. And if you don't have the right combination of driver and engineers all performing at the maximum, you get left behind.
Josh, what does this teach? What can entrepreneurs learn from what John just said? What are things that you can learn from the whole development of a Formula One car and being the best in that sport? How does that translate into business learning?
I mean, I think what F1 shows is really that, this is kind of the pinnacle in sports of meticulous planning, of needing a whole range of departments to come together, all for the purpose of building this one product that will be tested to absolutely insane lengths over the course of a season. But that at no point are you really safe from one little thing going wrong. And that's what happened with Mercedes. That one error basically snowballed and compounded into a mistake that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, and as John said, ended the Mercedes dynasty. So, that because you're working fast and because you're working in secret, it's very easy to not road test these things or to become overly confident. And this is a very expensive reminder that it doesn't take much to go wrong to suddenly mushroom into a crisis.
I'd also say the other thing I think that's also worth mentioning is that because F1 does this thing where they produce this huge, voluminous rule book and then leave that in place for 5 or 6 years and then change the rules again, what ends up happening is that these teams are basically like startups. Every 5 or 6 years, the regulations of the industry completely change, and they get a chance to start from scratch again. And so every 5 or 6 years, there's a chance for someone to get ahead of the rest by spotting a loophole or a gray area or an idea that can put them ahead of the pack. This is a sport about first mover advantage. There have been championships that have been won by teams figuring out what the sort of the new thing is, and then taking advantage of that for the first 10 weeks of the season while everyone else is racing to catch up. And then, that's been enough to get them over the hump. So I think it's a sport that really, I mean, more than any other sport, I think it's a sport that encourages innovation and sort of experimentation in the kind of gray areas around the rules, which I think is something that, also applies obviously to entrepreneurship.
Are they like University of Connecticut? University of Connecticut almost has had the same drought in women's basketball a decade until they just won the other day or this past week. Is Mercedes, do they, and they must be employing the smartest people on the planet. Do you see them turning it around and getting back into the winning track like Connecticut's done? Or the way they keep changing the rules, that's almost impossible to dominate that sport?
Well,
I
I mean,
think
their timing is pretty good. Sorry, go ahead, John.
no. I was going to say I think that the fact that they change the rules so often actually is a benefit to Mercedes. You know, it's unlikely that they will get back on top during this current iteration of the sport under these current regulations. But we already know that the next major overhaul of the rules is happening in 2026, and that will put everyone, like I say, everyone will be back at square one again. No one will be ahead of everyone else, and then it's a matter of who can find the best design and the best sort of interpretation of the rules for this new period, this new sort of era of the sport, which will again in itself will also last 5 or 6 years until they change the rule book again. And so every team has a sort of chance to. It was too late for Mercedes to catch up in this iteration of the sport, but the good thing about F1 for the teams competing is that you're only sort of 5 or 6 years away from another major rules change, and then everyone, like I say, starts at the same starting point all over again. The challenge for Mercedes is that they're not the only team that has been dominant in F1 over that time, and they're competing against the likes of Ferrari and Aston Martin and all these other huge automotive brands that also have the very best and very smartest people in the world trying to figure out what the best interpretation of the new rules is. So, it's a sport where, championships are often won in the middle of the winter during the off season in a sort of wind tunnel in a laboratory in, the middle of England, and not like on the track when you see the guy get across the line and get the checkered flag.
Yeah, I think the stock car racers here even have more familiar names to people than the cars that you talk about, the Formula One cars have. A question from the audience: Bernie Ecclestone, you have to explain who this guy is,
Mm.
has played a pivotal role in shaping the F1 business. Please comment on his style and decisions, the good, bad, and ugly. And was your research for the book difficult given the very secretive nature of the F1 culture?
I mean,
Um,
I think the
one
thing
of
to know
you guys
about
want to take it.
yeah, I think the thing to know about Bernie is, first of all, for all the good, bad, and the ugly, this is the man who built modern F1. There would be no F1 without, as a global enterprise, without Bernie, who is a British former used car dealer, who got into the sport first as an agent and then by buying his own team, and then ultimately realizing that this sport was much less about actual engineering and a sports competition than it was about being a promoter and selling TV rights. He understood that these were the different parts of the equation and that no one else had moved on that, so that he would be the guy to do it. And so for 40 years, he grew F1 from a collection of mainly British manufacturers and racers into this global series that became the pinnacle of motorsport. And what he did along the way was a thing that made him fabulously wealthy, which is understand that he could get paid by the circuit promoters, that he could package TV rights and sell sponsorship to this thing in different markets all over the world, and continue to develop the sport that way. Now, this is also a character who, was deliberately secretive, wanted to make sure that no one really knew what the inner workings of F1 were and what the business was. So he kept that to himself because he was always cutting side deals. He, at almost no point in the past 40 years, was he not being sued by somebody. Um, and so as he built up this thing, largely through pitting circuits against each other, pitting sponsors against each other, making sure he created this image of, for lack of a better word, this elitism through luxury sponsorships, through tobacco sponsorship as well. That we can't forget that was the lifeblood of F1 for about 30 years, until that came to an end in the late 2000s. But he did all of that until finally, in about 2010, it became very clear that a modern business could no longer be run on a wink and a handshake and a payment in cash the way he was doing it and had done for 40 years. So it was around that point that he ceded more control to a private equity company, and it was that private equity company that ultimately sold to Liberty Media, which is the current US-based owner.
As for the research of the book, um, yes, in some ways, F1 is a tough sport to report and research on because, like you say, they are incredibly secretive about the designs of the cars and the sort of aerodynamic testing and all that sort of stuff that happens in secret and is highly confidential. On the other hand, we also happen to be reporting this book at a time when F1 was, growing at a rate it sort of hadn't experienced in decades. And I think everyone involved was aware that they were riding this new wave of popularity and that now was the time to sort of tell the world about their sport and to broadcast to everyone what a sort of great success story F1 under Liberty Media has been. So, you know, it was actually relatively easy for us to get access to these people because they had a story, that we were reporting a story that they wanted to tell. It's just that there are some aspects of F1, running an F1 team that no matter who you are, they're not going to, tell you the sort of trade secrets that they're trying to keep confidential.
What kind of athlete do you have to be to drive one of these cars? And how do these guys get themselves ready? Uh, John, you can continue to take that.
Yeah, so you have to be a phenomenal athlete to compete in F1 because the cars are going so fast and going around corners at 200 miles an hour. The G-force on a driver is incredible. It's like being a fighter pilot or an astronaut. You have to be in sort of peak fitness. And so these guys are invariably, very fit, very small, very light people who, you can jam in the cockpit of the car without slowing it down too much. And you have to be, you obviously have to have the sort of, like I say, the laser quick reactions of a, F-16 fighter pilot. So yeah, and traditionally they were sort of drawn from Britain, as Josh said. F1 itself started as a sport of sort of amateur motor racing enthusiasts on the disused airfields after World War II. Britain had all these airfields that had been sort of abandoned, and those very flat surfaces were perfect for racing motor cars. So in the original days, a lot of the races were British. Now there's a much more cosmopolitan, much more global lineup of drivers. We have drivers from everywhere from Australia to the US. A lot of European drivers, Japanese drivers. So as the sport has become more global, so has the lineup of drivers and athletes who compete in it.
And one thing I'll add
Okay.
about their
Yeah.
fitness, the very specific thing that all these F1 drivers have in common is incredibly strong necks, and that's as a way to cope with the G-forces that John was describing. So you'll see them with as they work out using what look like medieval torture devices with weights that are hanging from the top of their skull so that they can actually strengthen their necks. And you'll see if you look at the in-cockpit shot watching F1, they are bouncing and bobbing around a lot as they go around these corners because they're only sitting about 6 inches off the ground or 10 inches off the ground with their legs out straight in front of them. So just being able to sit in that car for 2 hours, fighting the car around every corner is remarkable. They lose about 3-4 pounds in water weight because it's also incredibly hot in that fireproof suit.
Um, it seems we have a question from the audience. It seems that safety improvements have dramatically improved driver safety over the past 20 years. Or so is safety still a technical driver for engineering designs and improvements today? Uh,
So the last fatality on track was Ayrton Senna in 1994, and since then there was only one other very serious crash, and that was Jules Bianchi, who hit a crane that was in the wrong place in Japan, and later died following a long coma. But it was the Bianchi accident that led to one of the most significant changes in car design of the past 20 years. And you can see it. You see it on the chassis. They introduced what's called the halo around the cockpit, which is a narrow strip of fiberglass that is designed to protect the driver's head because the driver's helmet actually pops up above the cockpit and is otherwise exposed. This halo is designed to protect it from any debris or in a crash, and is held up by a very thin strip that's directly in front of the driver, but too narrow to impede their view of the circuit.
Why have there been so few women involved in Formula One racing? And how are they getting women more involved? Because you see a lot of women watch NASCAR and other motorsports in the United States. Why isn't there more women involved? And do they have a large following like it is in the United States for Formula One from women?
Yes. So Formula One is a sport that is very popular amongst women, especially now in the post Drive to Survive. So when Liberty Media bought the sport, one of its sort of probably its greatest innovation was this Netflix reality TV series based around the behind the scenes of the F1 season with all the various teams and drivers. And that is one of the things that really propelled F1 to new heights. And one of the sort of huge advantages of that is that as a Netflix reality TV show, it wasn't just the same sort of group of like male gearheads that had sort of followed F1 and motorsport before. It brought in this huge new female audience, which obviously makes F1 a very attractive proposition for advertisers as well, because it now has a very young and very mixed audience. As for why there are no why there haven't been any women drivers, I mean, I will say that there are now many more women working in F1 on teams as engineers and working to help produce the car and design one that can go as fast as possible. There is a separate women's TV, a separate women's Formula series that is just for women. But I mean, the short answer is that it's just incredibly difficult to get an F1 drive. There are only 20 of these seats open every year. And, so there are more members of the Philadelphia Eagles than there are like F1 drivers every season. And because there are so few, and because generally the F1 drivers, stick around for, many years, it means that the lineup of drivers, the roster of drivers doesn't change hugely from one year to the next. And openings are very, very scarce and very rare. The other thing to know about F1 is that the best drivers in the sport are paid like the highest earning athletes anywhere in the world. $50 million a year for the best drivers.
Wow.
But the drivers who are not the best, the drivers at the back of the track, usually have to bring in their own sponsorship money to justify their spot on the team. So you have drivers who are bringing sort of tens of millions of dollars in sponsorship to the team, and the main reason why they have their job, why they are F1 drivers, is because of the sort of private sponsors they're able to bring to the team to help fund it. So that it's just very, very hard to get one of these drives unless you're incredibly fast or sponsored by incredibly wealthy backers.
Oh, what's the life expectancy like in football, it's 3 years and you're out of the game for the average football player. What's the life expectancy of a Formula One driver?
I mean, I think an F1 career can vary wildly from just a few months because it's such a dog eat dog world. And if you come in and are clearly just not ready for the physical demands, and the pressure of F1, then they will not hesitate to turf you out and replace you because the queue of potential drivers is very long. But at the other end, you've got guys like Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, who've been in the sport since the late 2000s. I believe Alonso is in his 20th or 21st season in F1. He's older than some of the guys who are having the rookie season now. He's been in F1 longer than some of the guys who are having the rookie seasons now.
Which one? Given the constant pursuit of loopholes that you guys talked about earlier and bending of rules in Formula One, how do you see the balance between innovation and ethical behavior evolving in sport? And what role should the FIA play in ensuring the competition while still allowing creative engineering solutions, which has kept the sport fresh?
That's a smart question. So, just to sort of recap, yes, F1 is a sport that is really all about loopholes, finding loopholes in the technical regulations and then driving through them at 200 miles an hour. Um, some of the best car design, some of the most successful teams have been built around spotting these loopholes where you are trying to identify, small advantages that aren't necessarily in the spirit of the rules, but aren't technically illegal. And so when that happens, one team capitalizes, the rest of the F1 teams sue and try and get the car banned. The FIA delivers its verdict, and usually they side with the innovator because, like I say, it is a sport about innovation. And as Josh mentioned, many of these teams serve effectively as the R&D departments for the huge automotive brands that run them. Ferrari has long said that, has literally sets up its F1 factory on the other side of the street from its road car factory and expects that the innovations and advances that are developed in the F1 side will eventually filter through into their road cars. So F1 has always been a sport about exploiting loopholes, and in that regard, it comes down much more on the side of innovation than on ethical considerations. The teams think nothing about screwing each other over, pushing right up to the very limit of the rules, going past that, and then going past that even further, as long as what they are doing, as long as there's an argument that what they're doing is, not specifically prohibited in the rules, they will do it. And I think that's one of the great successes of F1, just sort of speaking about sports more broadly. I think that the sort of spirit of innovation and the exploiting of gray areas and loopholes is sort of one of the most compelling things about not just F1 but sports in general. And it sort of falls in the same category, honestly, as the tush push by your Philadelphia Eagles,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the new torpedo bats that we've seen in baseball. These innovations that bring excitement to the game. This is what sports should be about: pushing up against the limits of the rules, finding things that work, and then forcing everyone else to catch up. And I think that one of the things that F1 has done well is sort of embrace this spirit of innovation and challenging the rules and not being so sort of not being so concerned or not wringing its hands too much about whether this is in the spirit of the rules, and rather just letting people go for it and seeing what works.
It sounds like they have the entrepreneurial mindset, and these
Exactly.
guys are the ultimate entrepreneurs, right?
That's it. That's it.
I mean, that's what attracted me to reading your book, was because they seem so entrepreneurial. I mean, they even like entrepreneurs on steroids here. Joshua, how is it that a soft drink company like Red Bull, this is a question from the audience, has been able to compete and dominate against companies like Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin, and so on? It seems strange.
Well, it is strange. I think that's right. Red Bull, as the empire created in Austria by Dietrich Mateschitz, who was he had been a salesman and working in Southeast Asia, and came back with this concoction that he'd seen in Thailand, and that eventually led to the sugary carbonated version of Red Bull that we know today. But this is a guy who essentially got bored very easily. Um, And every time he came up with, he wanted to come up with new ways of branding and selling his energy drink. And so what he did was kind of create an association with anything that he perceived to be an extreme sport. And so we saw Red Bull arrive in things like, in various sort of off-piste skiing events and anything where people jumped out of a plane or jumped into the ocean. There's a lot of like throwing yourself into the void. But one way he saw that he could do this was also by creating an association with F1. And what he started out as quite a traditional sponsor, which was you pay a bunch of money, they slap the logo on the car, and that's it. But Mateschitz got bored again. That wasn't enough for him. And he ultimately decided in the mid 2000s to take over a team himself and become the official backer. Now, that didn't mean that Red Bull, the energy drink maker, was suddenly going to start making engines. They contracted a lot of that out. They bought the husk of a team for just £1. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. It was Jaguar, right?
Jaguar. Yep.
Yep. So they acquired that team, and of course, everyone at the team was incredibly mad that they were being taken over. This historic brand was suddenly going to be shilling for an Austrian Thai energy drink. He took big risks. He hired the youngest team principal in the history of F1, and that was a guy named Christian Horner. He hired a guy named Adrian Newey, who is one of the most successful designers in the history of F1. And he put those things together, told them we're going to do things absolutely differently from anything that's ever been done before. And they really did. I mean, they kind of decided to break open what had been a quite insidery, stuffy culture in F1. They brought in cheerleaders and they brought in electronic music DJs, and everything was going to be a party for them. And what was amazing about it is how quickly they got really, really fast. And so that gave them a kind of legitimacy to go on and keep hiring good people, partner with good engine makers such as Honda, and go ahead and rattle off a bunch of championships, which they've done now twice. There are two separate Red Bull dynasties. One that went from the late 2000s into the early 2010s with a driver named Sebastian Vettel, and the one that we've just seen, which is the past 4 world championships going to a guy named Max Verstappen, who is a driver that they built.
Do you think John, do you think it made a difference that Red Bull is backed by an entrepreneur and the way he thought about differentiate himself, because all the others are state companies run by people who are like big corporate types and are not so creative thinkers. How do you think the fact that this was backed by an entrepreneur made a difference to where you said they've won like 8 of the past 10 championships or something along those lines?
Yeah, I think it made a huge difference. And as Josh said, that sort of spirit that has imbued Red Bull right from the very first moment they entered the sport and still sort of persists to right now is just that they are a team that has been willing to push the envelope and challenge the sort of prevailing orthodoxy of F1, which as Josh said, was a very sort of gray corporate sport for a while before Red Bull entered. That was the sort of result of a previous F1 dynasty, McLaren, which had sort of conquered the sport in the 80s and 90s with most famously with Ayrton Senna, the Brazilian driver who died in a race in 1994. But Ayrton Senna's greatest years were driving for McLaren, and McLaren at that time were the sort of most professional sport. Their sort of USP was that they brought a level of sort of corporate professionalism to the sport that had been missing before. Figured out how to divide the car up into all these different parts for different sponsors on each different component, and and sort of beat everyone by virtue of leveraging their sort of corporate and commercial success into success on the track. What that meant was, like everything in F1, when they saw one team doing something and succeeding, everyone else copied. And for a while, F1 became a very very sort of monochrome sport, which was very it was a departure from how it had been beforehand. what Red Bull did when they came into the sport was really shake that up. And I think that was, as you say, that's something that's sort of directly attributable to this sort of entrepreneurial mindset of Mateschitz, but then also the young, people he hired who were, as Josh said, unconventional hires, but were also weren't of the F1 world. A lot of them were outsiders and were willing to do things differently, and challenge the way things had been done, in a bid to get ahead. And as Josh said, one of the great ironies is that F1 Red Bull came into F1 with this desire to make the sport cool and fun and young and edgy, and decided that they would do this by introducing this sort of brand new, a structure to the F1 paddock. In F1, the paddock is where all the teams sort of bring their bases, and these are kind of mobile, sort of, not exactly offices, but mobile, homes where they can debrief their drivers, and they can work out on the race strategy and the designs that they're going to use, and which type of spring is sort of perfectly is perfect for this track with the sort of very high speed corners. Red Bull didn't want to have a mobile home where they talked about which spring would be perfect for which high speed corners. They wanted to have a huge steel structure with a DJ set on top, light up DJ set on top. There were girls in bikinis trying to get sponsors to come in. This was absolutely not the way things had been done in F1. The paddock was supposed to be a very secretive, clandestine place where it was reserved for the F1 teams. Red Bull wanted all the public in. They started producing a tabloid newspaper about the goings on in the paddock, giving it out on race weekends. Just very, challenging the way F1 had always been. And the funniest thing was that they got given this spot on the paddock right next to McLaren, the champion of like corporate culture. Never wanted. Ron Dennis, the McLaren CEO, famously got the team to paint the floor of the garage every day so that it would look spotless. Red Bull was not about painting the floor of the garage. They were about having fun, shaking things up, and that culture also attracted the drivers, engineers. The engineers wanted to work for the cool team. The drivers wanted to drive for the cool team. And so that was sort of a huge part of them getting ahead, was just that the fact that they were so different from everyone else.
I mean, it sounds like a Silicon Valley startup.
Exactly.
And do you think that the founder of Red Bull basically took a look at what made him succeed and other entrepreneurs succeed, and applied those principles to designing his car team and his organization? Josh, you can answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. He came in, looked at what F1 was, and decided there's more than one way to do this. And went about doing it exactly the same way he built Red Bull, which is, as John said, by pushing the envelope, being outrageous, taking his brand, which energy drinks had not been in sports before. He brought that same attitude into a sport that never seen that before either. So it was just about pushing the boundaries and sort of rethinking what belonged in F1. And it succeeded very quickly.
But he sort of also had proof of concept from the drinks thing. He looked at Coca-Cola and Pepsi and was like, I can make a soft drink that will sell like these guys. And so when he took a look at like Ferrari and McLaren and Mercedes, he again he thought, no, I can do things differently. There's a space for Red Bull in this what seems like a sort of crowded market and a closed shop. I can carve out a space for Red Bull here.
Yeah, it sounds totally brilliant. And that sounds like another book for you guys, just to write a book on that, which I think would sell very well, especially for young business people, or I guess business people of any age. Joshua, stay with me here. Given Enzo Ferrari's complex and often contradictory character, how did his personal relationships and management style impact the Ferrari's team's ability to adapt to a changing technological landscapes and evolving competitive strategies in Formula One, particularly during the periods of underperformance?
I think the short answer to that is, it largely held them back because there is no other way while Enzo was alive, there was no other way of doing things at Ferrari that wasn't Enzo's way. He had final sign off and everything, even though he was not technically an engineer. But he hired and fired people. He had very traditional views on what made Ferrari the most sort of iconic team in F1. And even in an era, especially this became an issue in the 70s when other teams were beginning to explore things called the ground effects, which are, modern aerodynamics, anything that effectively helps the car kind of be sucked to the ground by what's called downforce. The faster you go, the more likely you are to skid out, except if you design the car in such a way that all of that speed and all of that air that's running over the car is actually pushing the car deeper into the ground to keep it on track. Enzo was a late adopter, to say the least. He still believed that the secret of F1 was very much who can produce the most horsepower, which it became clear was a rather antiquated view and did lead to some of those years of underperformance. As his thinking changed and as he got older and less involved the day-to-day running of the team, some of that loosened up and became a way for Ferrari to close the gap. And he clashed a lot with a driver named Niki Lauda, who kind of
Yes.
brought Ferrari back to the front of the grid in the 70s. And they had a measure of success together. They won some world championships, but make no mistake, Lauda, who was a big personality himself, bristled anytime Enzo had too much to say to him, and it ended badly. Enzo wound up firing him. Although if you'd asked Nicky, he's probably said, "I quit." So that happened time and time again at Ferrari until finally, after Enzo's death, a guy named Luca di Montezemolo, who had been one of the architects of the 70s success, came back in the early 90s and realized that the entire brand, the entire team needed a refresh. So on one side, he set about bringing modern approaches to the technical side, which meant building an enormous wind tunnel so that they could test aerodynamics, in-house and develop quicker than other teams. And on the commercial side, he worked on restoring that exclusivity to Ferrari. So he cut production. He installed an 18-month waiting list. If you wanted to buy a Ferrari, you couldn't just get one. So he treated it essentially like a luxury handbag. They created scarcity, they created exclusivity, and at the same time, the cars were getting better. They discovered a young driver named Michael Schumacher and signed him. Well, he wasn't discovered; he was discovered by different teams, but they signed him, and proceeded to create a dynasty in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Do you see more, and John, you can answer this question. Do you see more entrepreneurial billionaires entering this space, like they've entered professional basketball and baseball, and using mathematical formulas to go and figure out how they can beat each other? Because this sounds like a game of billionaires.
Yeah, so I mean the trouble with F1 is that they're all billionaires. The teams are either owned by billionaires or they're owned by, huge automotive giants like Ferrari, Mercedes. And there are only traditionally there have been very few teams competing in the sport every season. So at the moment there are 10 teams every season, and they have just announced that Cadillac will join F1 as a sort of way to capitalize on the sport's growing success and profile in the US. They have admitted Cadillac as a new member, which I think, Josh, is starting in 2026. Is that right?
Correct.
So, while I think that there will be a lot of billionaire entrepreneurs sort of eager to get into F1, and the challenge is there are not very many teams. They're all owned by very rich people or very rich companies, and so it's not the easiest thing to buy your way into the sport. It's not like Ferrari's F1 team will ever go on sale. To buy Ferrari's F1 team, you have to buy Ferrari. So it's, you know, it's a tricky thing to sort of get your way into the sport. I also think that like F1 isn't really a sport that can be moneyballed because it is money. It has been Moneyball ever since it first existed. It has been a sport that is that was won on spreadsheets and on databases and computers. Long before those ideas and those thoughts were introduced to baseball. As early as 1991, before computers had really been incorporated into road cars in the way that they are now, F1 had sort of pioneered the use of computers in the automotive industry, so much so that Williams, the team that sort of dominated the early years of the 1990s, had a car that basically was completely run by computers in the pits, and the driver just had to sit there and turn the wheel, and every other aspect of the car was controlled by a guy sitting on a computer in the back in the garage. That the use of the use of computers, to sort of change everything from the suspension to the ignition to the brakes. That back then, all that stuff was allowed. It was subsequently outlawed, which is usually what F1 does when one team steals a march on everyone else. They decided they were going to outlaw the use of computers in the same way that they had, and now even sort of average road car makes more use of computer chips than an F1 car does. But back then, F1 led the way, and so I don't think that that there aren't really the same areas to exploit for an entrepreneurial owner as there are in other sports, because F1 has literally been has been the sort of money ball of motorsports ever since it was invented.
A question from the audience, and Josh, if you can take this. When Cadillac comes in, does another team drop off?
Nope, they're expanding to 11 teams.
And why aren't they expanding to 24 teams? I mean, I imagine the Chinese want to participate since they're building big car companies in China, and it doesn't sound like Japan's very involved in this sport. Why don't they make it a true global sport by having all the automotive companies from around the world? India's making a big investment in this. Why isn't that happening?
Well, there's one thing to consider is that there's only so much prize money they can hand out, and the other teams have to agree. So it's already a big step for them to decide to slice the pie 11 ways instead of 10. Slicing it 24 ways would dilute the interest in actually being involved in the sport. And secondly, there are safety concerns about having that many cars on the circuit at once. If you wound up with, say, 40 cars out there, the whole thing would turn into a traffic jam, and no one wants to see that.
Do you see this being like Saudi Arabia doing what they did with professional golf and them inserting themselves into this sport and creating a rival league?
So they're already very entrenched in the sport. They have a Grand Prix. They are one of F1's title sponsors through Aramco. And there have been rumors, very persistent rumors, that Saudi might just make an offer to buy the whole series off of Liberty Media. That hasn't materialized yet, but there haven't been rumors that they would compete with a parallel project. They would simply take over the existing one.
And also, I would say that in terms of like the sort of global dimension of the teams involved, at various times during the series history, Japanese car companies have competed in F1. There was a Toyota team, there was a Honda team, even India, like Force India was a team. A lot of those brands got out of F1 after the financial crisis in 2008. And the as Josh said, the teams that stuck around and have sort of helped turn F1 into the sort of huge global success story that it is now, are sort of reluctant to then like share what they think is their hard-won, gains with new teams who quit when things got bad and didn't tough it out like they did. So, that's also one of the things that sort of might prohibit. I mean, to be clear, Honda still supplies engines and is sort of one of the Honda is in Japan. It has long been sort of synonymous with F1, and has had a long-standing relationship with F1.
Josh, beyond the financial and strategic implications of Fiat's acquisition of Ferrari, how did this partnership influence the team's identity and relationship with its passionate fan base? And what specific measures were taken to preserve Ferrari's unique mystique and independence within a larger corporate structure? You guys talked about that it changed enormously with the new leader in this space, leader of this organization.
Yeah, I mean, Ferrari within the Fiat empire has always had a kind of special status and been carved out from the rest of it. Even if it's not always insulated from some of the realities of running Fiat or the company that is now known as Stellantis, which oversees all of it. But Ferrari, had that dip in the 80s, and in the 90s, as I mentioned earlier, recreated and rediscovered that kind of elite status, that scarcity, that luxury aspect that had kind of deserted the company for years. But what's so important is that Ferrari has retained that philosophy of we are intrinsically linked to racing. F1 is Ferrari and Ferrari is F1 is something that Bernie Ecclestone used to like to say and frequently told Enzo Ferrari himself. It's the only team that's competed in every season of F1 since the series began in 1950. And by continuing that association, they believe that there's huge reward in terms of cachet, in terms of image, and what Ferrari stands for.
I mean, it has a halo effect, right? For everything they're selling. It makes it so much cooler, right? That's why these guys
Absolutely.
make this big investment.
And it's why they haven't changed the color of the car.
John, with the rapid technological advances at Williams and the subsequent ban on electronic driver aid, how did this regulatory change shape the future of Formula One, and to what degree did it shift the balance between driver skill and technological innovation in the sport's evolution? And I'm also wondering, what does AI play a role in the sport, if any at all, right now?
So to take your last question first, yeah, I'm sure AI is being used by every team in F1. But like I said, this is, bec and I say that, safe in the knowledge that everyone F1 has been at the cutting edge of literally every new sort of technological development of the last 25 years. So it is absolutely without question they are using AI, whether it's in the sort of, literal production line, with manufacturing components for the cars, or in, their sort of broader design and simulation work. I'm sure they're using AI, but like I said earlier, because AI is a fairly recent thing, that's not something they're willing to talk about because they keep everything that they're doing right now incredibly hush hush. So we won't have much an idea what they're doing until, several years hence, when maybe they start to talk about how they used AI in the early days. As for Williams and the, electronic computer aids that I sort of touched on earlier, yeah, I mean that was the reason that was given for why these things were banned. Williams, by, sort of certainly by 1993 or 94, had, managed to leverage the use of computers and electronic aids to such a huge degree that it was felt that basically any driver on the circuit could sit in the Williams car and would win the world title. They won the world title in 1992 with a British driver called Nigel Mansell, who then went to IndyCar and won an IndyCar championship as well. Nigel Mansell was in his late 30s, was considered a sort of pretty good but not great driver, and won the title in 1992 by such a huge distance that I think the title it was the earliest the F1 title had ever been won to that point. There were still some sort of 8 races left of the season, and no one really cared to watch them because it was so obvious who was going to win. The next season, they got Alain Prost, who had been retired from F1. He literally wasn't even racing in F1 the season before. Came back, sat in the car, easily won the championship again. And then the next season after that, a test driver, who they promoted to be the #1 driver, who no one had ever heard of, he won the world title, a guy called Damon Hill. So they at this point, Bernie and the people who run the sport decided that driving a Williams looked a bit too easy with all these computer aids, and they needed to outlaw this thing because what F1 did not want to do was create the impression that the drivers were not important. F1 has always sort of been a balance between you know, is the most important thing the design of the car or the skill of the guy behind the wheel? This is sort of one of the sort of fundamental one of the sort of fundamental points of F1 is that like both those two things are equally important, and you have to have the sort of right balance of the two of them. And a great driver can mitigate against some bad car design work, and a great brilliantly designed car can be driven by a guy who's maybe not the best and can still produce a title. But what they didn't want to create was the impression that the driver didn't matter at all, because in Bernie's mind, the drivers are the heroes of the sport. They're the gladiators behind the wheel. And as soon as you start to suggest that they're not as important as had been thought previously, then the sport loses a lot of its luster and a lot of its sort of marketability, because guys like Ayrton Senna were global icons. And if you could just plug some guy in the street to drive a Williams and win the world title, that wouldn't be the case. So they then outlawed electronic aids, and they've never really been brought back. And I think that was actually that was a clear, delineation in this the sort of progression of the sport, where they decided they definitely wanted the drivers to be the most important part. They have not really introduced electronic aids in the way they had them in the early 90s since. And it's also a time when F1, the development of F1 cars and the development of road cars that we buy and drive also, split and have sort of since progressed on separate tracks, because, as I said earlier, electronic aids are now, heavily used in road cars, much more so than they are in F1.
The hour went super fast. Josh, do you have anything last to say? And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I had no interest in this sport whatsoever, but I thought the book was super well written. And I thought there were a lot of entrepreneurial lessons that I could actually share with young entrepreneurs, like the students I deal with. So I think you guys did a great job. Josh, do you have anything final to say before we close out?
No, I think it was a fascinating sport to write about, just because of that willingness for everyone to realizing that the only way to continue existing was to push the boundaries. And so that meant there was the hardest part was actually figuring out what to leave out, and not what to put in.
Well, it sounds to me like there's a lot of books that can happen here, especially about the guy from Red Bull. I think that would be a really fascinating book. I don't know if anybody's actually written anything about him whatsoever, but it sounds like you guys have the makings of something really good that could be made into a movie as well. So I thank you for taking the time to allow me to interview you and for you to share your story with my audience. And I hope you guys have safe travels from where you're coming from. And thanks again for spending the time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.